Right, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. Before I introduce our speaker today, I just have a little announcement. We have a slight schedule change for our class. So previously, we were going to do Martine 2 days, September 29th and October 6th. And he was going to give us our assignment essentially on the 6th. We've had an event come up that we've changed now. So we're going to switch David Robbins up to October 6th so that we can take advantage of the special event that's happening on October 13th, which is a discussion around the future of water and agriculture in northern Colorado. It's at the Lincoln Center in Fort Collins. So how this is going to work is it's not mandatory to go to this event since it's off campus. So for our assignment, Martine is actually going to record let me skip to this. He's going to record the assignment, which will be like a 20-minute video. So about our deliberative framework and discussion guide that you will need to watch to understand what your assignment will be. But attending this event, if you attend it, you get like a free pass or an extra point on your attendance grade if you attend. So it's not mandatory. It doesn't count against you if you don't attend, but it will be a benefit if you do attend. And it's a very good opportunity to see one of, a very urgent, pressing issue right now going on in Colorado water, which is largely about transfers of agricultural water rights to municipal use, and specifically transfers of water rights, in this case, out of northern Colorado to other areas, and what that means for the economy and impacts. So there's more, I have more information. I'll post all of this up on Canvas so you have the information. So it's a screening of the film Mirasol, which is about similar ag water transfers in the Arkansas River Basin in Colorado. So they're going to screen the film, and then there's a panel discussion afterwards, which I will be moderating with some really great panelists. It's a wonderful opportunity to see in person what's going on. And that's, again, October 13th. It starts at 4, goes until 6. There's going to be some appetizers and things to entice you to be there. So hopefully you can make it happen. Okay. Any questions about that? Great. And we can talk after class too if you have any further questions. But make sure I'm still sharing my screen. So I would like to introduce our speaker for today, who is Professor Tanya Heikkila. She's coming to us. She's a professor and program director and a master of public policy and the co-director of the Center for Policy and Democracy at University of Colorado, Denver. And so what we're going to talk about today is really the role of institutions and kind of the framework of institutions in collaboration and conflict, and what role do they have in fostering learning and good water governance. So she's going to give us some really interesting specific examples that are going on right now. So thank you so much for being with us today. Yeah. Let me make sure I've got this is minimized here. Okay, I think that just has to be there.
Okay. Yeah. Awesome. Thank you, Karen.
Thank you.
And it's a real pleasure to be here. I just love this seminar. I was like, oh, I want to take this seminar. I've been studying water governance since my PhD program, where I did my PhD at the University of Arizona and studied the institutions that foster coordination in the management of groundwater and surface water in Colorado, Arizona, and California. And after that, I I did a postdoc at Indiana University with Eleanor Ostrom, who won a Nobel Prize for studying institutions for how they manage common pool resources like watersheds, and learned a lot from her. And then I went off to New York for a few years and worked at Columbia University, and dabbled in a little bit of international stuff. But I got an NSF grant back then to look at interstate water management in the Western US. And when I got the opportunity to come to Colorado, I was like, Colorado is the epicenter of Western water issues. I'm going. So I've been here to 16 years. I love, just being here. That's me on the Green River. I don't know. That was probably in Utah, but close enough. A couple of years ago, love rafting, just love water governance, but also do some work on other environmental issues, energy issues, and recently some work on housing related issues. But what I'm going to do is talk to you about kind of a series of research projects that I've had over the course of my career, and kind of some of the things that I've learned about studying institutions and studying both conflict and collaboration in the process of governing watersheds. And I just pulled a few headlines from the newspapers the last year or so to highlight, wow, seems like conflict is pervasive, right? It's everywhere. And some of these cases that are up here in the headlines are cases that I've done research on. I've done a lot of work in California recently, in the California Sacramento San Joaquin Delta, and I'll talk a little bit about that. Everglades, when I lived on the East Coast, I got into some really interesting work on management of the Everglades. Of course, coming back to Colorado, there's just never a never-ending supply of conflicts to study here. Colorado River, of course, everybody's been paying attention to, but hey, don't forget our rivers that flow east. I see you're going to do the Arkansas and the Republican. South Platte, there's some interesting things going on there. Pay attention to Nebraska's lawsuit that they filed. Yeah, and even when we think about, you mentioned, Karen, the transfer of water, to cities from ag. There's always this kind of tension between ag and urban, between the East Slope and the West Slope, and just these kind of constant challenges that we seem to be facing. Of course, we find ways to manage these, though. And so when we think about conflict, it's not the polar opposite of collaboration or cooperation. It's not that if we have conflict, we can't have cooperation, and vice versa. They're often working hand in hand. And sometimes we use conflict to spark collaboration. And sometimes our efforts towards collaboration create venues by which we can have dialogue and conversation around our conflicts. And so I do think it's important to also keep in mind that, yeah, we have these conflicts happening, but they're often hand in hand with these efforts towards collaboration. So highlighted a few headlines that, speak to collaboration for me. I was like, oh, actually there's some things going on in the Everglades recently that suggests there's some collaboration happening. California, there's some really interesting collaborative efforts around managing these, what they call these voluntary programs, where water providers are working side by side with the state, with other water stakeholders, to come up with voluntary efforts to improve water quality management. Lots of great examples out there. And so, I think it's important to keep in mind when we think of these examples, it's often because when we make decisions and policy around water, when we're governing water, there are a lot of different stakeholders, right? And we have a lot of different venues, decision-making venues and processes where folks are trying to come to agreements. And we have a lot of different actors with different interests, non-governmental actors, governmental actors. And conflict can be inherent because we have different values, we have different priorities. But there are ways to work through that through proper processes and channels. And it sounds like Martine's going to give you some good advice on that coming up soon. So I study these processes, these kind of institutional settings where conflict and collaboration happens. And I try to ask relevant research questions that are guided by theory, like what's driving policy conflict and collaboration around water? Or what types of institutions can enable learning in these types of settings? Can we use conflict to our advantage and create institutions that can be more sustainable and allow us to filter some of those different priorities into more productive outcomes? I often work with interdisciplinary teams. Frequently, I'm working also with stakeholders, trying to engage them in the design of research or in the research dissemination process, and use different sources of data from surveys to interviews, news media analysis, policy analyses. So I'm trained as a social scientist in kind of policy sciences, which is interdisciplinary in itself, but I also like to work with folks in engineering, in hydrology, in geography, planning, those types of fields. And all of my work tends to be, like I said, theoretically grounded, and I often use theories and frameworks to kind of help me decide what am I going to focus on for answering a particular question in a given context. I mentioned Eleanor Ostrom, who I did my postdoc with. She was known for this institutional analysis and development framework. It's a very generic framework if you want to study institutions. But I'm often looking at what we call these like action situations or action arenas where actors are interacting in a conflictual or maybe a collaborative way, and trying to understand how those interactions can produce good outcomes like learning. And so I've really spent a lot of time on this idea of learning, and I'll spend a little more time for the rest of my talk here kind of getting into what I mean by that. But let me first give you the water setting. So a few of the watersheds I've studied in the past. I mentioned when I got really excited to move back to the Western US from living in New York, I had this research grant to study interstate water compacts. And you'll notice there's one missing from this map that is probably the biggest one, a big one. We, with my colleague Adela Schlager, who was my PhD advisor, she's at University of Arizona, we did a lot of research to study state-to-state compacts that didn't have a strong federal presence. And so the Colorado River Compact, because of the role of the federal government, and because it's just such a big, messy thing and could be its own study in and of itself, we kind of set that aside and said, well, what's happening in these other interstate compacts? How are they designed? How are they addressing conflict? A lot of these compacts, I mean, most of them were signed 100 years ago, 75 to 100 years ago. How are they responding to the changing circumstances of climate change, of growing urban areas, of endangered species issues? How do they adapt over time to these kind of new challenges that weren't on the table when the compacts were signed? And so we had this kind of 5-year study that really dug into these kind of conflicts, but also the ways in which states and different water users engaged in addressing these conflicts, and which conflicts kind of bubbled up into big fights and landed in the Supreme Court, and which ones they were kind of able to negotiate and work through in a less costly manner. So I'm not going to talk a lot about those, but just to give you, I just want to give you the context of kind of where my research agenda has been. few other watersheds that I've studied. I mentioned the Everglades on my first slide. I had a study with my colleague Andrea Gerlach that we started when we were assistant professors back in 2002, looking at these large-scale watershed restoration efforts in the U.S. So 2 on the west, the Columbia River Basin, the California Bay Delta, and then the Chesapeake Bay and the Everglades, 2 on the east. And we were really trying to understand how are these kind of large-scale restoration efforts, watershed restoration efforts being designed? And are they adapting over time? Are they bringing in stakeholders, and are they bringing in science into decision making? A lot of the research at the time from the social scientists that were looking at watersheds in terms of collaboration were really focused on smaller scale watersheds. And we were trying to understand, well, are some of the same factors like trust building really important in these large scale systems, or are the other factors kind of driving these initiatives? So we had a few publications there, and we also, and I'll tell you a little bit about the Everglades. We then also did a deeper dive into the Everglades. Couple watersheds that I've been focusing on now. A couple years ago, I went back to the California Bay Delta. I serve on an independent science board for the state of California that allows me to dig into all fun things water related in California. Any Californians in the room? Yoo-hoo, where are you from?
I'm from Arcata.
Arcata, yo, beautiful. Where are you from?
Oakland.
Oakland, yeah, you know what we're talking about here, okay.
From LA.
LA, well, where do you get all your water in LA?
Yep.
Get it from Northern California, goes south. Okay, so great to have the Californians in the room. I'm from Oregon, so, you know, I respect the Californians, yes. Also, of course, I'm in Colorado. You know, I should study the Colorado River Basin. So I've gotten involved with some research projects on the Colorado River Basin. I don't know if folks know Tammy Albrecht in the back of the room. Tammy and I were on a big grant proposal recently related to this basin that was so cool. And the National Science Foundation had different priorities. So more to come on that. We'll see. Anyway, so what have I learned? What have I learned in studying these various places and the collaboration and conflict? Well, let me go back to the Everglades. Florida Everglades, any Floridians here? Yeah, Tammy. Yeah. Did you grow up there? Okay. Yeah. I mean, Everglades is just such an amazing ecosystem. If you ever get a chance, if you haven't been there, go check it out. There has been an effort in place really since the 90s to address some of the ecological challenges that were created when in the early 20th century, we really wanted to get all the people and farms into southern Florida. And so we dammed and diked and sent water instead of into the natural flow of the Everglades, the historic flow, we sent it out to the coasts so that farms and people could be there. And when they realized, well, that's going to kill a lot of birds, it's going to cause a lot of water quality issues, it's going to cause all kinds of issues with sea level rise, various other things. Hey, let's try to fix this. So this collaborative effort was put in place to try and restore at least a portion of the historic flows. It was a collaboration between the federal government, the state government, some local water districts, tribal governments, this huge multi-billion-dollar effort. We started studying this around 2005, and this kind of institutional setting that they created was this kind of spaghetti map here. I'm not going to walk you through this, but just know there were like these venues created. There was an institutional structure created to say, we're going to make some good decisions about where to prioritize our management actions here. And we're going to bring science into this process. There was science working groups. We're going to bring citizens into this process. There was a citizen advisory group. We're going to have management teams that like inform this, and we're all going to learn together. And so I went there with my friend Andrea, and we were like, well, is this working? And a lot of people were asking us, like, is this working? Is learning happening? And we were like, how should we measure this? I don't know. And so we like decided, well, let's study this idea of learning. Like, are folks learning from the science, and is that informing decision making? Has this institutional arrangement allowed us to make science informed and also stakeholder informed decisions that improve based on, some kind of objective measures, improve the functional management of the Everglades? So we did this survey, and we came up with, we surveyed all the folks that were involved in this kind of spaghetti map. And we only had about 96 respondents, but they talked about some things, and we really didn't know what we were doing when we started this study. We didn't know how to study learning. And so we were just asking them, like, what were there moments when you learned? Were there particular things? And if so, what was driving this? What were the sources of information? And we kind of started digging inductively into this research, and we were like, oh, well, there's some patterns here that, maybe seem to be suggesting that dialogue matters. Shocking. Okay. And then we also did this case study because everybody kept talking about this Accelerate program that the state had put in place when the federal government didn't have a lot of money. But in doing this process of kind of inductively trying to figure out what was happening in the Everglades, and then also really diving into a lot of empirical literature from organization theory, education studies, natural resource management, public policy, we started looking at literature around learning, and we were like, well, there's some patterns here that we think go beyond the Everglades. And so we put together this learning framework. So we now have our own framework. I showed you the little Ostrom framework before. We're like, oh, hey, let's have a framework. But really what we looked at was how the institutional structure, through the rules that were in place, the social dynamics, like how much communication folks were having or how much trust was in the system, but also kind of the technological and functional domain, like what issues were they talking about? There's some issues that were a little more ripe for learning than others. And so we were able to kind of disentangle some of this in the Everglades and then really think about, well, what does that enable in terms of a process by which learning happens? Are they actually bringing information into that spaghetti map that I showed you and translating it for the people who have different understandings and different knowledge, and then disseminating that across the system? And that, when we see that kind of process happening, and we had kind of different hypotheses of what led to that, we were more likely to see kind of the cognitive and the behavioral change that we might expect when there is learning. So fast forward a few years here, and let's go back to California. So you'll see this messy map here. This is basically water infrastructure in California, right? We have the federal project in black. We have the state project in yellow. We have dams, pumping stations, natural flows, rivers, lots of stuff on here, right? And basically, water in California, taken from the north, sent to the Central Valley and to Southern California. Of course, Southern California will also get water from Colorado River, but all that water goes through the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta. And that delta used to be a very productive ecosystem. Massive wetlands. Of course, what did we do in the early 20th century? We built all this infrastructure to move water out of the delta, down south, and that created a lot of problems for fish, for birds, for recreators, for the tribal people that live in this area, for salinity, all kinds of problems. So this system is just, I mean, like folks in Florida like to say, "Oh, the Everglades is a total mess," but then everybody in the Delta are like, "No, this is an even messier place." I mean, you have everything from land subsidence to levee failures, salinity, harmful algal blooms, invasive species, habitat loss, economic issues, largely because of the diversions that happen in this system. But also, there's a system of levees in order to protect the agricultural areas and prevent floodwaters from getting into those agricultural areas. And of course, we have climate change on top of this with reduced snowpack and risks of sea level rise. So lots and lots of challenges here. But, the state of California has more resources than many other states. And they're often more forward-looking when it comes to governance. So the state of California has really designed a system, an institutional system in the Delta that is intended to have some learning built into the system. What you see here in this kind of spaghetti map is a set of what we call organizational venues, where there's collaboration that happens. And in the blue dots are collaborative venues. And the other dots are different types of actors, consultants, state agencies, research folks, water districts. And in this system, each of these venues is a place where knowledge and information, science, stakeholder preferences can inform decision-making and, in theory, allow for adaptive management of the system. And this figure on the other side of the screen is what's called an adaptive management cycle. Anybody familiar with the adaptive management concept? It's fairly intuitive, right? You get information, knowledge, you update your management decision-making procedures based on new information, you build in systems for evaluation. So it's this intentional kind of institutionalized approach for learning and how this institutional system is managed. And it's baked into state law in California. They require that there is an approach to adaptive management in managing the Delta for water supply reliability and also for ecosystem management. But then they have all these different places where this adaptive management can occur, these different blue dots, these venues. And with some colleagues at University of California, Davis, my friend Mark Lubell and some of his students, and then also my friend Andrea Gerlach, who worked with me in the Everglades, we were like, well, is this working? So we have this system that is designed for learning, and we wanted to know if it's working. So we did a survey. Ignore all the little dots here for a moment. We did a survey of the folks who were in that spaghetti map. And we really wanted to know, both within those blue dots, those individual venues that folks are involved in, but also across the system, is there kind of evidence that learning is happening in terms of that adaptive management cycle? And so we saw some initial patterns around what are they learning, and all the details, the words on this slide. We operationalized this concept of adaptive management into kind of this planning stage, analysis stage, and doing stage, or the plan, do, and evaluate and respond. So the red categories are more planning. The green categories in the middle are more about doing the management actions. And the blue categories at the bottom are about kind of evaluating and responding. And so overall, the survey respondents, so each of the little dots on this slide is a survey respondent. You can see there's a lot of variation. A lot of people have very different perceptions of whether or not they're doing well on these things. Are they actually learning? So when we look at the averages, it's telling us a story, but it's also not telling us the whole story when you look at the distribution of these responses. But again, what we've found out and what's probably not surprising is that, yeah, the planning stage seems to be adaptive. Like folks are taking this information and it's shaping new plans, new ideas. But when you get to that implementation stage, it's often where the politics get really hard, right? And so when we think about this idea of like learning and are we managing the conflict that is inherent in the system, there's a lot of conflict in the system. There's, the Northern California, Southern California, the ag versus urban, the fish versus pick your thing, lots of conflict in this system. But they're through these venues making some progress. It's when you get to the and now we have to put this into practice. That tends to be where it gets a little tougher. And then we did some analysis of characteristics of both the individual respondents and also the venues that they were involved in to try to understand, well, what explains some of these differences? I mean, these are perceptions of learning. This is not my objective opinion. This is the stakeholders telling us we think we were learning. Probably not surprisingly, but maybe, I don't know, I think it might have been surprising to some of the folks there that where the venues were evaluated for having higher levels of trust and better leadership, we were more likely to see positive indicators of learning than if they said they had good resources. So the resources didn't matter as much as the kind of social dynamics or even like representative engagement. What's interesting is that the two top bars up there, and these are modeled based on the different stages of adaptive management, so you can kind of ignore those. But the two top bars are these individual level characteristics, and what it's basically showing is that as you participate in more forums, if you're somebody who's like really deeply engaged and you have a lot of expertise in the system, your perceptions are more negative of the system. So the old timers who have been there a long time are like, yeah, things really suck. Oops. So yeah, I mean, there's something there. Anyway, we have another paper coming out of that study, hopefully soon, that's also kind of looking at learning, but looking at the system level and how well the system as a whole is kind of coordinating information and working together. So stay tuned for that. I also wanted to share a couple things on Colorado. So oh yes, please.
Just had a question on that last slide.
Yeah.
Resources.
Yeah, that it's like financial resources, technical, like sometimes technical resources, like does that, and we were asking about, there's all these little like kind of different venues. They're like advisory bodies or a task force or a working group on like endangered species or lots of these kind of like subgroups that as a whole are trying to like work out how we manage this messy, complex system. And so within each of those subgroups, we did ask, like in this venue that you participate in, to what extent are the resources, do you have adequate resources in terms of staffing, in terms of financial resources and that type of thing? Yeah, so not like water resources. Yeah, great question. Yeah, so Coloradans, we've got some Coloradans in the room. Yay, right. Anybody from other Colorado River Basin states? Any Arizonans? No? Utah? New Mexico? No? Wyoming? No one from Wyoming? Okay. Nevada? All right. Well, I know we have some Californians in the room. And yes, California still counts. Okay. I'm sure you all, this is a water class. I probably don't have to explain the importance of the Colorado River Basin to anyone here. Probably gotten that already in this class. Touched on it. Yeah. I mean, it's huge, right? 1,400 miles. We have 7 US states, 2 Mexican states, 29 tribal nations, 5 million acres of farmland irrigated, nearly 40 million people that depend on this water, hydropower, recreation, species, lots of dependency. And of course, like the Delta, I mean, I didn't put up a map of where all the stressors are coming in this system, but also a highly stressed system. And largely because of climate change and acidification in the Western United States, but also because we draw out more water from this system than we allow to be put into storage, which we have 2 major reservoirs, right? Like Powell Lake Mead. And those major reservoirs are our bank in addition to snowpack. But as we put in less water into that storage system, we're getting to the point where we might not be able to draw water out and send it down to the folks in the lower basin. So there's lots of conflict in this system right now, but we wanted to understand how within this system, kind of like in California where we have these little venues, how is science kind of being used to help with the learning that's going on? Because the politics is often, we hear a lot about these, state to state dialogue and all this complaining, but there are these collaborative efforts that are happening within the basin that are really making a difference in terms of how we manage for things like endangered species or for water quality, or how we adaptively manage the flows through the Grand Canyon. So there are a number of these types of like venues or kind of institutional settings. And we picked 7 of them. This was with Andrea Gerlach and a couple of her PhD students, and also Elizabeth Cobley, University of Nevada, Reno, and then Mark Lubell, and then Linda Mendez Barrientos, who is at DU. We had a great team. We were looking at whether or not qualitatively, so rather than doing a survey, we did a set of interviews in these programs. And we interviewed folks who were really involved in the science, because we thought, well, at a minimum, we should be able to see some science. It's okay. Filtering into learning. And one of the things we learned was that like for a while, we had really been focusing our efforts on studying these kind of positive outcomes of learning, like was adaptive management happening? Was there improved decision-making? Was there a change in the kind of strategies for managing problems based on this new information? And what we realized in doing this more qualitative work, these interviews, is that there's also a lot of non-learning that's happening that we weren't studying. This kind of blocked learning, or non-learning. And non-learning was essentially like, hey, there was information and they were just like, we're not even going to look at it. Versus this idea of blocked learning where there was some learning happening, but it wasn't getting translated into action. So they were acknowledging this, like these new ideas, but it just simply wasn't getting translated into action. And then we did this kind of inductive qualitative analysis, going through the interviews in an iterative fashion, using the framework I showed you that came out of the Everglades work, where I said, hey, after we did all this work in the Everglades, we were like, hey, let's have a framework. We were looking at these social, structural, and technical factors that might explain learning. And some of the patterns we saw were that, well, social factors like effective communication and trust came up in these interviews, but also reliable funding, quality of information, using experimentation, these all mattered. But when we looked at why learning was blocked, we would see things like, well, there was a lack of effective communication or a lack of funding. So kind of almost the opposite of what was happening in the cases where there was learning. Versus the non-learning, there was, pretty clear evidence that sometimes, just conflicting stakeholder interests, you just can't get over them. Sometimes they just are that's gonna be the barrier, and it might take longer. It might take a different venue. It might take a different approach. And of course, things like funding and scientific uncertainty came up as well, or lack of funding, I should say. But lots of different factors in these kind of interviews. And just, we had some interesting kind of quotes that I wanted to share before I wrap up here. Like on the blocked learning, where this idea of where sometimes we learn, but we fail to adapt. Folks talked about like uncertainty and how like uncertainty kind of gets complicated. He said there's, way more science done and it never gets applied to policy. I think that's true everywhere, not just in the Delta. There's a longer quote around this, but like this idea that there's just continuously a need to kind of keep doing the science, but it almost becomes an excuse because, oh, well, there's just still some uncertainty, so we can't take action. Versus some of these conflicting stakeholder interests in the Lower Colorado River program. There was example of the non-native sport fisheries. They consume 90% of the native fish. These non-native fish were consuming 90% of the native fish, but there was no interest in controlling the sport fish because the angler community had a lot of power. And sometimes political power wins out. And other times we fail to learn or learn perhaps even the wrong lessons, which is something we have to be thoughtful about too. In the Upper Colorado Endangered Fish Recovery Program, there was a lot of data on these non-native fish species and different control programs, but there's just more uncertainty. Like we didn't know, we had the data, but we weren't sure of an alternative to what was already being done that might make things better. And again, conflicting stakeholder interests. San Juan River Basin Recovery Program. A lot of people believed in the non-native fish removal program, despite evidence that it wasn't working. So there's even this belief that you just can't even overcome sometimes that can really get in the way. And of course, I like to end too with this reminder, this cautionary tale of, learning the wrong lessons, right? And how we have these institutions. So Colorado River Compact is an institutional arrangement. We have created an agreement, and we've layered on even more agreements on top of that. But we created an agreement at a point in time when the flows of the Colorado River Basin were exceptionally high, when we didn't have good knowledge. I mean, we had some knowledge, actually. There was awareness by some scientists even then that was an abnormally high flow period when they were negotiating the Colorado River Compact. But when you look at the tree ring reconstructions, the streamflow reconstructions that have been done now over centuries, we know, we have some high flow years, but we have a lot of very low flow years and multi-year low flow years. And yet we sign this compact at a time when, hey, we think we have the right information. And then we bake that into our institutions, because now we have a set of agreements that says the upper basin states get, 7.5 million acre feet, lower basin gets 7.5 million acre feet. We don't have 15 million acre feet in the basin. And we may never have that much water again, especially due to aridification. So yeah, we can learn that we can think we're learning something and we learn like, oh yeah, well, we can divvy this up. We can come up with a plan. We can, but if we bake that into our institutions and we don't allow for the adaptability and the flexibility of our institutions to respond to new information, and we don't design intentionally, we could really put ourselves into a pickle. And, we are. So look at projected water demand compared to projected water supply. It's not a pretty picture. So just want to end, these are my last two slides, I promise. Andrea Gerlach and I, we were both on sabbatical a couple of years ago, and we were thinking a lot about this learning work that we had done. And we did kind of a synthesis of what we had learned and what a lot of the empirical literature had shown in studying learning and environmental governance. And, just some simple but obvious, hopefully, takeaways. Good processes are needed if we want to avoid, baking in bad learning into our institutions. You need to build trust, you need shared understanding, you need diverse interests at the table, and you need transparency. But you also need, within these messy institutional systems where we're not just looking at one venue or one kind of policy arrangement, we're looking at an entire system where decisions in one part of the system impact another part of the system. You really need strong connectivity of the actors in that system in order to build the type of communication and knowledge and shared understanding that allows for system-wide coordination. So with that, I'll wrap up, leave some time for questions, and yeah, thank you for having me. Questions?
Or online.
Yeah. Yes. There's always a, just got to take a moment. Sorry. Yeah. Mhm.
Offline versus
Mhm.
like the learning. Did you find were their findings surprising, or did you have any assumptions going in that were like rejected by that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good question. We didn't have a lot of expectations initially. Our kind of initial expectation was just that, oh, well, maybe it's the opposite of the factors that support learning. If you don't have those things, then you're going to have blocked learning. And what we found was more nuanced than that. It's not always just the absence of those things, but sometimes, it can be these factors that you wouldn't expect. I'm trying to think of a good example. I mean, I do think none of them were surprising in terms of, you know, our kind of practical evidence. Yeah, it's not surprising that when you have conflicting stakeholder interests, that can kind of block learning. But some of these kind of more nuanced ways, this just belief in a non-native fish removal program, that kind of surprised us, because these were venues where a lot of science and scientists were involved. These weren't just any kind of stakeholder. There were NGOs involved. There were some, other types of water management stakeholders that would get involved. But most of the interviews were with folks who were coming from a strong science background. And so we had this kind of it's almost this low bar expectation, right? That in these venues, we would expect to see learning. We would expect to see the ability for folks to come to agreement on what the science is saying and to come up with shared recommendations for management, because that's what they're designed for and that's what folks are trained for. But even in those venues, you see this kind of level of like conflict and also just, this natural kind of human tendency to become steeped in our own kind of values. And you can imagine scientists do this too. Researchers are not, like immune from being biased towards our training and our values, right? And so you might spend 20 years doing this non-native fish removal program, and like you're just partly because you put all your life and energy into this, you're convinced that it's like this is the way to go, even if there's evidence that it's not working. And that's not, I guess, not surprising because we know about human nature, but it was something that we weren't totally expecting. So I appreciate the question. Yeah. Yeah.
So you shared some examples where there were like in the Colorado Compact, federal versus states. Do you see ever like, I don't know, a power dynamic or like conflict because of the federal perspective versus the state's perspective? I know the Colorado River Compact has a lot of
Yeah. Yeah.
How you see from having studied just interstate.
Oh, yeah.
Versus,
yeah.
Like ones that do include.
Oh, the federal role. Yeah. So the question I'm repeating for the online folks is, are there kind of power dynamics with the federal government and states? And how does that kind of play out in the conflicts? In this particular study that I showed here, we were looking at these kind of federally sponsored programs. So there was a strong federal lead in each of these, but there were sometimes state level actors involved as well. And we didn't see that dynamic in these particular cases, but when you scale up to what we're seeing, in the news media today, yeah, there's always this interesting dynamic between the federal government and the states. Partly because in the Colorado River Basin, the federal government, what is their role? Their role is to largely manage the reservoirs, but also to manage some of these other things like endangered species and some of the water quality issues. And so it's not just reservoir management, but the states, when you're looking at negotiating and trying to come up with a new plan for how are we all going to take cuts, the states are looking out for their own best interest, right? And so often I think the tension that I see is the feds kind of like, we got to make, let's get on the same page here. We got to get on the same page. And if you don't get on the same page, we might have to, push everyone onto that same page. There's always a little stick that can be held out. But, I think the federal government over the years has also tried to encourage collaboration and cooperation amongst the states. But there is often this kind of tension of the feds like saying, yeah, there's, if you all don't make your decision, we can make it for you. So, yeah. Other questions? Yeah, Karen.
Yeah, my question is about this study and having been involved in the Colorado River Delta Environmental Work Group,
Oh, yeah.
like firsthand.
Yeah.
Being familiar with these other groups, like it seems like there's pretty significant differences in like the composition of them. And I was wondering
Yeah.
if you saw if you had any insights just based on like the composition of the groups and, is it heavily dominated by, USGS or Bureau of Reclamation or,
Yeah. I think I cut the slide. It's probably in the paper appendix or something. We did kind of lay out like the group composition in each of these. In the paper that we did for this particular set of interviews, we really didn't have the space to dive into that kind of analysis of like, how does the design and composition of the groups matter. It wasn't like a comparison of the groups. It was across these programs, what are some of the patterns we're seeing in terms of what's enabling learning or like leading to the blocked learning. And that was really like the extent we could take it. But there was always this like urge for us to be like, but the design matters, like who's involved, how often they meet, all of these things. I think that is a really great next like research question if somebody wants to, you know, go take these programs and start to compare them. My recollection in terms of like at least the program diversity is that they're all pretty diverse. I mean, but I think in practice, yeah, you'll probably find some where there's a lot more of a strong, you know, role for the USGS and they're kind of dominating things versus others where it's a little more of a truly collaborative effort and there's kind of, you know, consensus building and that type of thing. That would require, I think, doing a deeper case study into each of these and really probably going through meeting minutes and documents that they produce and doing interviews with lots of all the folks involved. It would require more time and effort than we had available for this, but I think it's, yeah, you're spot on. Yeah. Other questions?
Okay. Any questions online?
Yeah, we're almost done.
Okay.
Well, thank you all for having me. This was really fun. And bye to the online folks.